It's a real great pleasure for me to introduce, you can stand, Falina Enriquez, who is actually a young scholar that I wasn't familiar with her work, but was recommended by one of our former postdoctoral fellows at Watson Institute, Duff Morton, who said, I want to suggest a really wonderful emerging scholar that should come to Brown. And so we reached out to her, invited her. Falina Enriquez received her PhD at the University of Chicago in the Department of Anthropology. Since 2015, she has worked as an assistant professor in anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research employs theories and methods from linguistics and cultural anthropology to examine the cultural politics of Brazilian music. More broadly, she is interested in how people use music and other expressive forms to envision the social order and their place within it. Her article, The Ins and Outs of Cultura, How Bands Voice Their Relationships to the State-Sponsored Music Scene in Recife, Brazil, was published in 2012 in the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and she has published book reviews in several publications, including the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology and Lucid Brazilian Review. I had the pleasure of having dinner with her last night. We talked a lot about what it's like to be teaching at a state school that has been under attack by the right and diminishing resources, and also trying to address issues of diversity and cultural inclusion. And she teaches a class of how many?
800.
800 students at Wisconsin. So the intimacy of Brown we can value a lot. So I'm really, really glad to have met her and that she's here. She will be speaking for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open it for questions and answers. Unfortunately, I have to slip out because I have a meeting. Before 1 o'clock, I have to leave here. But we'll have a conversation. If people need to leave for class, as usual, they can feel free to leave after the lecture. But we'll linger on until the questions have been answered. So again, I want to thank you so much, Falina, for coming to Brown, and thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Dr. Green and thanks to Ramon Stern for inviting me and organizing this. I know how much work goes into bringing speakers, as I've done it myself. So today I'll be talking about some of the entrepreneurial strategies that musicians in Recife, which you can see is can't see very well, is the capital of Pernambuco. In the process, I'll also be summarizing some of the arguments I'm developing in my book project that's tentatively called Music and Multicultural Branding in Recife, Brazil. And it's based on dissertation research that I did a while ago and also more recent data from the past few years. So since the 2000s, Pernambuco state government has made significant efforts to promote the state as a multicultural place, in large part through sponsoring a wide variety of music. Recife's multicultural carnival epitomizes these efforts. It features musical genres as proxies for specific types of people. A state agency staff member typified vernacular and institutional views about Carnival in Recife. He said that during the event, quote, "You see Brazilian popular music, MPB, featured there on the slide, and maracatu all on the street, people with financial means and beggars," end quote. MPB, a set of middle-class pop styles, aligns to those with financial means, as he says it, while the traditional percussive genre maracatu invokes beggars due to its historic ties to Recife's marginalized Afro-Brazilian residents. The variety of music/people, which Carnival and other state-sponsored events showcase, differs from other musical events, from private musical events in Recife, like pop music concerts that cater to upper-class young people, or unofficial pre-Carnival parades dominated by dance music like axé, and attended by revelers who elites mock as lower class. Yet, contrary to popular conceptions in state publicity, Carnival's musically mediated inclusivity and state sponsorship more generally are less about democratizing and preserving culture and more about harnessing people as citizen entrepreneurs who enhance the state's economy and reputation. So in other words, I'm arguing that Pernambuco's multicultural discourses constitute a form of place branding, and this redefines citizenships on entrepreneurial terms. The discourses also aim to integrate the state into a kind of imagined upscale global marketplace. Pernambuco's music scene thus provides a case study for understanding how place branding makes the reshaping of citizenship and subjectivity more visible. So as various scholars demonstrate, within the past 15 years, hegemonic Brazilian discourses and policies have shifted from defining citizenship in terms of participatory democracy to recasting it through entrepreneurialism. So for example, Aaron Ansel discusses that during the 2000s, federal assistance programs reimagined citizens as entrepreneurs and consumers who could contribute to expanding economic growth. Of course, these shifts aren't exclusive to Brazil. They're especially prevalent in places where deindustrialization, privatization, and underemployment have pushed people to rely on entrepreneurialism, especially related to tourism. For example, as Jesse Shipley shows, the political economic liberalization of Ghana in the 80s and 90s caused the state to become less involved with, how he put it, quote, shaping the populace's aspirations, which correlated with the general valorization of the entrepreneur as the nation's ideal citizen. But the widespread emphasis on entrepreneurialism also isn't an exclusively top-down process, right? Individuals are themselves reconfiguring and redefining how citizenship and entrepreneurialism are interrelated. So the musicians that I'll cite today are actively engaging with new bureaucratic mechanisms, domestic and international discourses, technologies, and aesthetics in ways that help them construct themselves as professionals and compete in an increasingly precarious and competitive economic context. I situate my comparisons within recent studies in anthropology, such as Alana Gershon's new book. It's called Down and Out in the Economy, and it argues that individuals are responding to new economic demands by becoming more entrepreneurial, and more specifically by making themselves into brands. So in keeping with studies like these, I show the performative and performance-based ways that musicians brand themselves and create new versions of what I and others call the entrepreneurial self. So I'm going to describe 3 musicians as examples of different kinds of musical entrepreneurs I see emerging in Recife. There's the business entrepreneur, the transnational entrepreneur, and the patrimonial entrepreneur. By comparing them, I sketch a range of entrepreneurial strategies they use to achieve a professional image. They're all professionals in a practical sense because they approach music as a profession and not as a hobby. But in a largely informal industry, achieving the kind of stability commonly associated with professionals is difficult, if not impossible, right? So together, these cases show how professionalism and entrepreneurialism are becoming increasingly interdependent. The most effective way to present oneself as a professional is seemingly through being entrepreneurial. This is especially relevant to the musicians I'll discuss today, since they don't have major recording contracts, they aren't targeting mainstream success. Instead, they rely primarily on cobbling together publicly and privately funded opportunities. These musicians also reinforced my broader argument that Pernambuco's state-sponsored music scene reinforces inequality along intersecting lines of class and race. State sponsorship and Pernambuco's multicultural branding project might provide a platform for some musicians to become more entrepreneurial and autonomous, but they also leave them more vulnerable to economic fluctuations and don't provide enough support for marginalized people to overcome structural inequalities. So the 3 musicians I'll describe have directly and indirectly benefited from the state government's interventions. And like their peers, they encounter major obstacles in pursuing music as their main occupation. One of the difficulties they face is that although Recife is a large city with about 1.5 million residents, the music market is a lot smaller and less lucrative than bigger cities like Sao Paulo, right? This means there are few private venues available for musicians, especially those who appeal to more so-called indie crowds and who play folk music. Pernambuco's state and municipal governments are therefore they remain the primary source of work for many musicians in Recife. But they also don't support a steady stream of small concerts throughout the year or other kinds of projects. Instead, the bulk of their sponsorship efforts target really big seasonal events like Carnaval, but also São João, for example, in June. This means musicians endure cycles of feast and famine. Also, most wait 6 months or even a year, sometimes even longer, after they've performed to receive payment from a government agency. And this is a really big burden, especially since musicians contracted to play for government events have to front all of the money in order to make it happen. So if they have to go to multiple cities, they have to pay for all of the transportation and not receive payment for an indiscriminate amount of time. So the first example I'll talk about is a business entrepreneur. That's what I think of him as. Despite music's significant role in Pernambucan identity, the financial instability musicians face and their association with festive contexts means many people don't see musician as a real job, right? So Eduardo, who's pictured here in the foreground, is a former member of a rock/Afrobeat band called A Roda, and he's since branched out to producing and composing commercial and political jingles. I describe him as a business entrepreneur. Although he considers himself an artist, during the past several years, one of his main goals has been to gain more financial stability and respect. He explained that people don't take musicians seriously as professionals. They think musicians, quote, live with their parents their entire lives. End quote. When Eduardo began playing music as a teenager in the 90s, his parents disapproved of his musical ambitions. His mother, a civil servant at the state Supreme Court, was somewhat supportive because she had played drums in school, but his father, an independent businessman, was much more dismissive. Eduardo recounted an episode when his band was invited to play at a big rock festival in the city. Rather than congratulating Eduardo, his father admonished him. He said, quote, "Go study so you can pass a civil servant's test, because music isn't going to earn you any money." Consequently, for many years, Eduardo oscillated between pursuing music as a hobby and as a profession, with stints working at a beverage distribution company and sometimes for his father as well. These experiences helped him gain some of the business acumen required to finally pursue music as his sole profession. But the tensions that he's faced are not unique. Many of my interlocutors describe similar circumstances, which reveal how financial instability contributes to the perception that musician isn't a viable or respectable profession, even among relatively well-off families. So given these experiences, Eduardo wanted to make himself more legible as a professional. In 2011, he wanted to register as a microempreendedor individual, individual micro-entrepreneur, or MEI as I'll call it. And it's a federal tax status that was instituted in 2006 and then later expanded, intended to formalize the generally informal economic activities of small-scale entrepreneurs, things like street vendors, manicurists, hairdressers. So registering as an MEI enables individuals to hire an employee and systematize their contributions to different forms of insurance. For Eduardo, registering was an important step because it would give him what he called a marca de uma empresa, the mark or the brand of a business. MEI status would also theoretically streamline his interactions with government agencies and private organizations. So, for example, as an MEI, he could issue a bill of sale, called a nota fiscal, without having to rely on and also pay a third party. So 2 years later, in 2013, the MEI's effects on Eduardo's career were favorable, but subtle. One of the major advantages he cited was how the approximately $17 monthly fee associated with maintaining MEI status goes towards one's contributions to Social Security and to health and workers' compensation insurance. These are, of course, really small amounts, but they're still an improvement given that most informal vendors, and certainly the musicians with whom I interacted, rarely had any savings or any kind of insurance. Yet, MEI status didn't achieve one of the main goals, one of Eduardo's main goals, which was to expedite his interactions with government agencies. Although he saved money generating his own bills of sale, it didn't speed up the payment process. Being an MEI also does little to protect musicians from economic fluctuations. In 2012, Eduardo had considerable success composing music for political campaigns. During that year, his father began to see that being a musician, quote, really was a business that generates money and a job like any other, end quote. Unfortunately, 2013, a non-election year, was less profitable. Due to an economic downturn, businesses reduced publicity funds from their budget, which left Eduardo with fewer opportunities. However, enrolling as an MEI partially enabled Eduardo to move out of his home studio and establish his own office space at a production company. This greatly enhanced his professional image. Before doing so, he had commented, "Man, I have to get out of the house because I seem like just a freelancer," and he used the English word freelancer. Later, he stayed productive during another slow year by joining forces with two acquaintances to form their own production company, Jabuti Produções. And although they had a minimal budget, they drew on mutual friends to develop their business. So, for example, Eduardo's former bandmate, a drummer, designed the company's logo. By 2015, the company had moved into a downtown office with a large workspace, equipment, and recording booth. And 2 years later, they're still doing well, and Eduardo has shed his MEI tax status to become a business partner. Eduardo's experiences reveal MEI status can be part of a musician's entrepreneurial toolkit to enhance their professional image. It provided him with a financial and bureaucratic bridge between his work as a freelancer and later as a partner in a small business. Yet his personal connections were more fruitful than MEI status on its own, because they led to the formation of a larger business. His case shows how bureaucratic mechanisms and formalization provide some support for entrepreneurs, but ultimately individuals' informal social networks are just as, or perhaps more important, for achieving professional success and managing economic downturns. This suggests the musical entrepreneurial self, oriented toward achieving the mark of a business, as Eduardo exemplifies, is limited to those with relatively high social status, business literacy, and financial resources. The next musician I'll discuss is Jam, as in Jam Session da Silva. His experiences reveal social media and digital technology as integral elements of a musician's entrepreneurial strategies, especially because they facilitate the creation of a brand, which in turn reinforces a professional image. So Jam's originally from Recife, but he spent more than a decade living in Rio and also in France until he returned in 2015. He's released 2 albums as a solo artist, and he's played with multiple bands, including Massilia Sound System, a reggae band from Marseille. He's produced film soundtracks and composed songs recorded by various Brazilian and European musicians. He's also toured extensively. In 2014, he shared the bill with 2 prominent musicians from Recife, which you can see on the left, Siba and Nana Vasconcelos, who passed away in 2016. They performed for the Festival Conexão PE, and it was a tour co-sponsored in part by Pernambuco state government to promote the state's music in Argentina and Uruguay. And Jam also performed at the NYU Abu Dhabi Art Center in 2016 with Orquesta Santa Massa, which is also led by a Recife-based musician named DJ Dolores. So Jam's international connections illustrate how globalization has minimized some of the geographic and social boundaries between musicians. But Brazilian musicians have long performed and lived abroad. But unlike, for example, Gilberto Gil and Caetano Veloso, right, who were exiled during the dictatorship, as his press release reads, Jam sees himself as a, quote, voluntary exile. Also, unlike previous Brazilian musicians who had often arrived to foreign countries without much preparation, without learning the local languages, for example, Jam uses the internet and social media to contact potential collaborators and venues well before his arrival. So, for example, before he went to Iceland in 2014, he spent 2 years setting up performances and projects for his 2-week stay, including filming a music video. So Jam's trip to Iceland and the music video he produced there show how he positions himself as a transnational musical entrepreneur who's nevertheless still tied to Pernambuco. The video for the song Gaiola da Saudade, Cage of Longing, juxtaposes scene filmed in Pernambuco sertão, or desert, with Icelandic landscapes. The video includes visual parallels which sometimes seem to blur the distinction between the 2 places. As he told me in an interview in 2015, he wanted to tell a story of love lost, which combines, quote, 3 deserts, the cold desert of Iceland, the hot desert of the sertão, and a desert of the hearts of the protagonists. He described the song, which he wrote with another world-traveling Pernambucano, Maciel Salou, as, quote, very universal, and that he doesn't, quote, see it as a Pernambucan thing. Guitar and bass arpeggiations form the core of the groove, while the drum kit remains somewhat distant. And this sparseness is part of Jam's aesthetic. He resists using too many layers, as he said in English, by minimizing the amount of tracks recorded. He commented that when Brazilians hear his songs, they think it's a, quote, gringo production, or North American production, because it's sparse and everything is in its place, end quote. He developed this approach while recording in France, where he learned to, quote, bring out the essence of the music. However, despite the ostensible gringo-ness of the sound design, he hears the song's lyrics and melody as Northeastern. For example, the timbre of the string arpeggiations that form the song's main riffs resemble the viola, a guitar-like instrument associated often with the rural sertão. The lyrics also build on perennial Northeastern themes, mainly migration, alienation, and nostalgia. The chorus, which says, "Why feel pain, why hold on to it? The sun burns and cracks the ground, and the moon illuminates it," fits with many forró songs, which use the landscape to express emotion. And also in keeping with classic forró, the song also mentions drought, but in a contemporary twist, is part of climate change. So I'm going to play you a clip of the music video. So it gives you a nice overview of what it's like, but it's about 2 minutes longer in reality.
Vivo andando no mundo, na gaiola da saudade, igualmente passarinho, voando solto nos ares, querendo água e comida, pra matar minha vontade. Deixo minha terra chorando, pra morar noutra cidade. Tempo bom foi o passado, na época do meu avô. O homem tá destruindo o que a natureza criou. Planta semente na terra, espere a chuva não cai. Por causa de tudo isso, tempo bom ninguém vê mais. Para que sentir a dor? Para que se telar? O sol queima, racha a terra e a lua clareia. Para que sentir a dor? Para que se telar? O sol queima, racha a terra e a lua clareia. Na estação pego um trem, sigo firme na estrada. A bagagem é minha roupa e a raba é cafunada. Vem a noite, não dá sono, na madrugada cochilo. Vejo a chegada do dia, não sei qual é o meu destino. Para que sentir a dor? Para que se telar? O sol queima, racha a terra e a lua clareia. Para que sentir a dor? Para que se telar? O sol queima, racha a terra e a lua clareia.
Okay, so there's that awkward cut. Now, the thematic and sonic fusions that Jam creates in Gaiola da Saudade coincides with his overall branding strategy. His online presence on his website and social media accounts reinforce him as a transnational artist who's nonetheless anchored to Pernambuco and Brazil. Social media platforms are well suited for performatively creating a transnational entrepreneurial self because, as Alana Gershon argues, they accommodate multiple actors and authors. For example, by embedding other people's comments, Twitter and Facebook make it possible for a musician's production team, peers, and fans to contribute to their brand image. Jam's Twitter profile alerts followers to the dialogical creation of his online identity by including the phrase updated by the production team, just below his name there on the left. Also, his official website includes a press release authored by a writer named Caio Jobim, and quotes from this release are embedded in the descriptions of Jam's YouTube videos. This creates a professional-looking cross-platform coherence. The content of Jam's social media also enables a crisscrossing between people and places, which feed into a simultaneous transnational Brazilian image. On the one hand, his photos, retweets, etc. connect him to multiple locations and situate him within a global network of genres and artists. His Twitter profile, for example, links to videos and photos of artists he likes, like Bjork and Fatoumata Diawara, a musician from Ivory Coast who's based in France. On the other hand, the same profile visually and textually integrates him with his peers from Recife and across Brazil. Also, Portuguese dominates most of the text included in his online presence, so these things are still sort of rooting him. During our conversation in 2015, Jam gave more details about his entrepreneurial approach beyond his musical aesthetics and social media presence. He discussed how he selectively collaborates with multiple promoters to draw on their specific forms of expertise. Some are more focused on sales, others on logistics, and others specialize in acquiring grant funding. Once he understands the promoter's focus, he develops a marketing strategy targeted to a specific goal and usually an audience, and he describes this process with the English word branding. Like his social media strategies then, his marketing strategy is also collaborative. So Jam is just kind of a starting point, really, for untangling how professional musicians are using branding in ways that present them as professionals and make their musical aesthetic legible in multiple ways and in multiple formats. He also provides an example of how musicians can brand themselves as transnational while still being locally rooted. In Recife, musicians like Jam are increasingly more the rule than the exception, but mostly among a limited set of primarily educated, middle-class musicians who have the financial and social capital to successfully navigate social media, state funding, and collaborate with a production team. Thus, while entrepreneurial transnationalism presents new possibilities for self-determination and profit, it's not universally accessible. As Donald Robotham argued in 1998, anthropologists, and we all, must consider, quote, whose transnationalism is at stake and what ends it serves, end quote. The final musician I'll be discussing today is João da Guabiraba, a senior performer of the folk genre ciranda. While watching him perform at a state-sponsored concert, I witnessed him proudly declare, "Eu sou cultura," I am culture. Meshi Guabiraba's statement highlighted his official designation as Patrimônio Vivo, or living patrimony. In 2002, Pernambuco became the first Brazilian state to institute this designation, which I'll henceforth refer to as PV designation. PV designation recognizes folk musicians and other folk artists who've been active for at least 20 years. It enhances folk artists' credibility by bringing them into more formal access and contact with the state government, and consequently by incorporating them as part of its multicultural brand. The designation also includes a monthly stipend which supports folk artists in their efforts to teach their knowledge and practices. Meshi Guabiraba is legible as living patrimony because of his 30-plus years of experiences playing ciranda, and because his background and physical characteristics match the genre's connotations as a nostalgic musical form performed by racialized rural people. As someone with a rural speaking style, relatively dark skin, and who grew up helping his father cut sugarcane, Meshi Guabiraba not only plays ciranda, but for local audiences, he looks and sounds like it too. His background and stance as a cultural embodiment mirrors most PV designees, but of course sharply contrasts with Eduardo and Jam, who I just talked about, who see themselves as artists and wouldn't claim to be incarnations of local culture. I therefore interpret Meshi Guabiraba as a patrimonial entrepreneur. Patrimonialization is an institutional process that objectifies marginalized people as embodiments of collective heritage. And in Brazil and across Latin America, patrimonial discourses have been crucial for solidifying nationalism and reproducing state power. But more recently, transnational discourses led by UNESCO and reinforced at local levels have championed intangible culture and patrimonialized people as resources for economic growth. Thus, I see Meshi Guabiraba, his claim to be culture, not just as an expression for his clear love of ciranda, but also as an entrepreneurial response to the state's commodification of patrimony. As scholars like John Collins and Alexis Bunton have revealed, investigating how exoticized people are transformed and transform themselves into entrepreneurs shows how the power surrounding and generated by these processes are simultaneously productive and repressive. Musicians like Meshi Guabiraba and similar PV designees seem eager to embody culture because it gives them new ways to transform their otherwise marginalized identity into a legitimate form of social capital. Yet, PV designation also demonstrates the state uses and standardizes the category of folk art to transform potentially embarrassing rural, lower-class racialized people into productive citizens. These institutional discourses entrap folk musicians in a contradictory position. They're supposed to embody nostalgic, disappearing cultural forms, but they must also be modern entrepreneurs who can navigate a competitive and often faddish global marketplace. While I don't see PV designation as a liberating force, it's also not totalizing. Meshi Guabiraba's declaration reinforces essentializing discourses, but it also pushes against the passivity that these entail. By announcing that he is culture at a state-sponsored event, he anticipates how he'll be interpreted, and in so doing, he invokes his own authority. I thus see his declaration as an example of what Summerson Carr calls anticipatory interpolation. This is when a person is aware of the institutional subjectivity ascribed to them and elicits those in power to address them as such. Mestre Guabiraba's declaration and his self-presentation thus push local institutions and audiences to view him as a cultural embodiment. He therefore knows how to engage with institutional discourses to gain legitimacy and recognition. So in effect, he's branding himself in accordance with Pernambuco's multicultural brand. Part of Mestre Guabiraba's brand also rests on the fact that he composes his own songs. This makes him stand out since many folk musicians play songs from the public domain that they then alter through improvisation. But by composing his own songs, Mestre Guabiraba isn't just representing folk music, he is creating it. His ability to compose is therefore an entrepreneurial skill which enhances his value within the folk realm. Paradoxically, then, Mestre Guabiraba's claim to be cultura seems to emanate less from an essential quality and more from his ability to manipulate culture. Consequently, he can maintain himself and Ciranda in the present and future, instead of being relegated to the past. However, as Daniel Sharp discusses, many other folk musicians in Pernambuco struggle to be recognized in what he calls the here and now. Mestre Guabiraba thus shows how folk musicians strategically accommodate patrimonializing discourses while still highlighting their labor and artistry. However, he's also a significant exception in a context where lower-class racialized practitioners of folk genres often face discrimination, structural equality, and a lack of state support. So this picture on the left shows that Ciranda is danced in a circle, and people sort of do a kind of grapevine movement as they go around. And I don't have a good recording of João da Guabiraba, so I'm going to play for you a clip from a song by Liagita Maracá, who's also a Patrimônio Vivo designee and also composes her own ciranda and is locally famous for doing so. It's just a small clip within a song.
Vamos dançar ciranda, ciranda da beira-mar. Vamos dançar ciranda, cirandando pela praia. Lá vai ter cirandeiro, no passo, na dança, na bancada do mar. Lá
That's all we had time for, sorry. So the three musicians I discussed today reveal a range of possible roles within the parameters of Recife's primarily state-sponsored music scene. They're all professionals, but they're also entrepreneurs who use various aesthetic, bureaucratic, and performative strategies to reinforce their professional brands and target specific audiences. Taken together, these musicians reveal insights relevant to Brazil and applicable to broader contexts. They show how musicians are taking up state discourses which brand Pernambuco as a multicultural place and use them to their own advantage. However, they also show how state sponsorship and the music industry more generally unequally channel people based on race, class, and also gender. As you may have noticed, besides that small aside to Liagita Maracá, who's largely an exception, I didn't discuss any women today. And that's in part because, as I'll show in my book, relative to men, women participate much less as performers especially in the sort of pop-style state-sponsored bands. And in the folk realm, women often act as sort of dancing and singing accompanists while men generally play the core instruments. These three cases also give insight into how individuals are negotiating the transformation of citizens into entrepreneurs. Popular discourses often portray this shift as a liberating force or at least as a safeguard against economic instability. But while entrepreneurialism indeed offers new opportunities, it can also create new problems and challenges. Moreover, as musicians compete in the economy as entrepreneurs, they're also giving rise to new strategic kinds of subjectivity. Thank you.
If you have questions, and I would like to have the prerogative of having the first question.
Sure.
I loved your talk, and I think one of the things that's exciting about the Brazil initiative is we're trying to tackle the understanding of a continental country that has a very complex history and culture, and it's impossible to know. It's an endless search for understanding the country, and I learned a lot today. Your presentation was clear, and Wisconsin's lucky to have you.
Thank you.
And those students and those lecturers too. I wonder if you could talk a little about something we discussed last night, which is two things: the post-coup d'état, golpe, and the clear shift away from the state, the federal state, as being a vehicle for strong support of culture, even though there was pushback and they tried to eliminate the Ministry of Culture and artists as kind of a privileged sector within the pushback movement were successful, and there was a retreat on that front, but there's clearly a strategic plan to limit government expenditures for the state. And the second is this question of periphery, the marginalization of people who are not under what they call in Brazil the eixo, the axis of Rio São Paulo. The way in which, even though historically the Northeast has had many people demanding or claiming the importance of the Northeast as a cultural depository of the essence of what Brazil is, that story of Gilberto Freire, but also the tremendous economic power of Rio São Paulo that makes it so hard for these regional endeavors to happen. And I think of all of them, the two that probably are, well, maybe they're more than two poles. I was going to say Bahia and Recife, but perhaps I think maybe all the larger state capitals are in the same battle to do the same thing of branding and inventing their own carnivals and off-season carnivals and things like that to kind of for tourism and for other things. So if you could just comment about that a little bit.
Sure.
I meant to slip out. I apologize.
Okay, no problem. I'll address your second question first, which is that, yes, it's really hard to get away from the Rio Sao Paulo issue, right? Because that is where the most money is made, and that's also where the centralized form of media is made. So a lot of artists in Recife who can, like Jan da Silva did, go and live in Sao Paulo or Rio and end up creating a broader base there, and then sometimes come back, or will just end up going in between both cities in order to sustain themselves. But that's usually the sort of more kind of indie rock slice, whereas if you're a folk performer, that's much less accessible to you. So you could maybe do a tour of Sesquis around Sao Paulo and other places in Brazil, but that doesn't really give you enough to live on, right? And at the same time, there's a lot of pushback. Daniel Sharp writes about this in his book. I can't remember the exact title, something between nostalgia and apocalypse or something like that. Thanks. How, folk groups then get lots of pushback when they do start touring more broadly, and especially internationally, as like kind of selling out or losing their authenticity. So that whole repository of Northeastern culture thing is still really operational and holds back a lot of people as much as it gives people also the kind of space to make music more possible. So that's why I see this tension constantly operating, especially with folk performers. So ultimately, the Rio Sao Paulo thing is kind of impossible to fully get around, but that's been what I've seen emerging in Pernambuco as a strategy of trying to get around that pull of Rio Sao Paulo and trying to convert their state not just into a repository, but into like an active, we have all this culture to appeal to the whole world, right? But part of the problem there, too, is that they're needing to brand themselves in a kind of nichier way so that they don't get confused with Salvador's carnival, for example. So a lot of discourses I've encountered where they say, like, well, our carnival is much better because it's public, it's free, you can just hang out on the street, you don't have to pay for admission, and then also we have lots of different kinds of music, which, as I sort of explained, by proxy means there's lots of different kinds of people, so it's much more multicultural and therefore much more modern. And so this kind of, there's a jockeying for position even within that Northeast that kind of cuts the pie even smaller than it already is, right? In an effort to attract more people, but I think it also kind of cuts down on overall resources as well. It sort of funnels it more targeted in more targeted ways and doesn't necessarily trickle down as much. And post-coup, it's interesting because, so as the federal funding has kind of receded, the state government in Pernambuco has tried to expand local funding more, but from everything I can tell, and I haven't been in since 2015, but 2016 they kind of unveiled this new program and that they were going to pump a lot more money into local culture. But from what I can tell, it hasn't really had any significant effects. And so that's also part of why I see a lot of this as a kind of branding, because it's more about the visual, the optics, as they say, than it is about substantive changes. So I'm probably going back in March, so that's one of my objectives in March, is to see really beyond the kind of propaganda that I'm seeing online, what's really happening with this expansion of the state budget for culture in light of the fact that the federal government has receded. Yes, in the back.
I think this whole idea is fascinating, and I'm just wondering, is Brazil in the forefront of this kind of state funding, or I mean, when I think of Brazil, the first thing I think of is music.
Mhm.
It's in, so it's really almost a national product.
Yeah.
And I think, I spent some time in Cuba about 3 years ago, and, you know, obviously not the same economy, but the amount of musicians was just absolutely overwhelming. There was music everywhere. And I don't think they've capitalized, the Cuban government has capitalized on that. Personally, I'd like to see more countries give tax incentives to musicians than to baseball teams. So I think there's a much
You
more of a
upset about the win last
long-term
night?
product. So I'm just wondering if this may be something that could be expanded. I just came back from Canada, where they're in the process of doing all kinds of, you know, at least attempting concerts and music and locally supported, not,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, you actually mentioned two examples that I was going to cite. It would be Cuba and Canada that have both invested in trying to sponsor music more, often in an appeal to gain tourism. Canada is also interesting too, because they also have a kind of multiculturalist perspective that in funding more culture, they're also fomenting and showing their multiculturalism, right?
Part of their government.
Yes, it's sort of built into the policies, and it's also built into the policies in Brazil too, right? Because culture is enumerated as a constitutional right, the ability to access and produce it. Although it never really defines what culture really means, and so that's why you can see a lot of different places in Brazil taking these rights and enforcing them to different effects and in different ways. And so Pernambuco has done it in this way. I think too that it's just because of history that Brazil is known for its music, right? It just happened that way historically, and that became a way for them to kind of be present in the world. But even today, when I have students who I ask them, what do you know about Brazilian music? They usually know very little, and they don't realize like how much Brazilian music we're exposed to in the United States in pop music, but because it's never just like an artist that people know about. It's like a song written by Sérgio Mendes performed by Black Eyed Peas, right? Or it's something like that, like they'll know about it indirectly but not directly. And this more globally, this is going on in lots of different places, and often it'll be a city that's focusing on promoting their music scenes. I mean, New Orleans is an example, of course, right? But there don't seem to be a lot of other cases of entire countries trying to do as expansive a thing as I see in Pernambuco especially. So in Europe you get it a lot, but it's for classical music, not necessarily as much for pop music. And here they're really trying to do sort of include as many genres as possible, of course, while excluding those naughty dance music genres, right? And that's like a whole other can of worms to discuss. But in any case, in some ways they're exceptional, and in other cases it's kind of par for the course in this kind of global context where culture and music are becoming more and more commodified as things to attract tourists especially. Any other questions? Just random ones about Brazilian music? I'm totally up for that. Yeah, in the back.
Hi, wonderful talk. I have a very tangential question.
Sure.
The status that's granted folk artists as living patrimony, and the remarks that the fellow you featured is composing his own songs in folk style, I assume. Makes me wonder, Brazil has been active in the World Intellectual Property Organization as promoting sort of communal rights over traditional music. And I'm assuming that these new composers are able to copyright their own new pieces. And I'm wondering if that is ever discussed as bringing up attention between the right of the group, however that's defined, or possibly the state, to own its patrimony versus the individual's creativity.
That's a really interesting question. It's a lot of layers to unpack, though. So I don't know specifically in João de Guabiraba's case that he's copyrighted his music. I'm assuming he has. Most musicians in Recife that end up producing an actual physical CD tend to copyright it. Also, that physical CD is often co-sponsored by the state, but I don't know legally where I would assume the ownership rests with the musicians, but given that it's got that state seal, if there have been any legal contests to that in any way. I assume, too, they have to sign some kind of legal contract that says you're allowed to distribute my music in X, Y, and Z ways, but I actually don't know the mechanics of that. The other thing is, I haven't heard of a lot of discussion about this in Recife. I feel like there might not be enough of a kind of critical mass to make that happen. However, back to Between Nostalgia and Apocalypse, Daniel Sharp's book, he does talk about this one family that had a, quote, Samba de Coco group, who then splintered off and then had a sort of legal copyright battle between them. So it does happen, but I haven't heard a lot about it in Recife in general, yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
I'm still trying to formulate it, but I had one quick question. The beggars, what was the Portuguese word for that?
Oh, he used, I think he used mendigos.
Mendigos?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Because I was just wondering if you could speak more to, and maybe it's just outside of what you're researching, but people that wouldn't necessarily be considered entrepreneurs, or the other, so like the Afro-Brazilian maracatu, like if the ciranda artist was sort of in that category, or if there's another sort of category of people that can't access the sort of entrepreneurial ways, and if you've seen what their strategies or you know the things they're running into.
Yeah, so I mean, like, João de Guabiraba, as kind of talked about, is an exception in himself as well, because he has this Patrimonio Vivo designation, kind of puts him, and he's also composes his own songs, kind of puts him at a higher level within the folk realm, and that's why he's sort of, he can be entrepreneurial, because he has access to the kinds of discourses and resources that he would need to do so. But there are plenty of other folk musicians who, you know, if we're making kind of essentialist arguments, one could argue embody culture much more than he does, right, for whatever reason, but don't have any access to that, don't have the time, don't have the literacy required to write a grant application, or don't have access to someone who could help them to do so, live really far away from a major city, so they can't really get good internet, so that they can't, right, there's all of these obstacles that kind of snowball once you start looking into it. And I worked with a group called Cambin da Estrela, that was a maracatu group, that actively positioned themselves, even though they were participating in some state activities, were kind of resistant to these multicultural discourses, because they're like, you're not actually including people, and we're still marginalized, we're poor, and we're black, and they would say negro, right, which can be very politically charged in Brazil, especially in this kind of, we're all together and this is a festive context thing, like Carnival, right? So they'd come into Carnival and wearing like Black Pride t-shirts and things and saying like, we're in this, but we're also against this at the same time, in part because they didn't have the same resources and glossiness to appeal to the kind of more powerful people that other maracatu groups could. So in any case, like, it's just a nesting of different hierarchies, even within the scene broadly, across the folk and non-folk realm, within the folk realm, within the non-folk realm, and it keeps going kind of fractally. So there's all kinds of different reasons and that channel people in different ways.
What was the name of the group again?
Cambin da Estrela. Yeah.
Wonderful talk, thank you.
Thanks.
I have a, I don't know if you can answer that, but just a conversation about that.
Sure.
because the notion of entrepreneurship, how do you say that in English?
Yep, entrepreneurship, yeah.
As a core for citizenship.
Yes.
Right? Is being used against artists in Brazil by the right,
Mm-hmm.
by the people who had supported the coup d'etat,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot, for example, because part of what you're saying, that is a wonderful thing, that's having that kind of state, not government, kind of funding for arts.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that all artists all over Brazil have been using to
Right.
keep alive their work.
Mhm.
And this is under attack during the whole process of impeachment and since then, I think they are like from art exhibitions of naked people or whatever
Mhm, mhm.
bodies that have been prohibited to how do you say, like Caetano Veloso and his
Mhm.
family and has been beaten up by they were censored in a
Mhm.
way
Yes.
last week on Monday, and they have been how do you say that?
Fala em português se quiser.
Que agora nem a palavra em português. Quando você fala mentira.
Fraude.
They are being accused of sexuality, violence, how do you say that?
Slander.
Child abuse, things like that,
Mhm,
because
mhm.
of you see, there's a huge social movement,
Mhm.
righteous social movement, MBL, is called
Right.
about it, who's using the notion of citizenship, of entrepreneurship, as a way to tackle down all the traditional state funding and support for arts.
Mhm.
And you must compare it to the US, for example. We never have, it's very rare to have in public schools,
Yes. Yeah.
music class. People learn music by themselves in their community, with their parents, in streets, and there is no formal education, as you have here or in Europe,
Mhm.
to music. Music's not part of the curriculum.
No.
And it's the first thing to be cut, right, from students. So it's a miracle that we have that kind of music in Brazil.
Yeah.
And it's not a systematic way of educating people and putting them valuing this, right? But there was, on the other hand, all kinds of things. So my question for you is, how have you looked at the other side of the idea of entrepreneurship and
Mhm.
citizenship,
Mhm.
or, you know,
Mhm.
as a, from the right perspective,
Mhm.
especially in Pernambuco, because the Pernambuco government supported, it is a traditional socialist party
Yeah.
from a highs,
Yeah.
you know, which fought against the dictator, but supported the impeachment. I mean,
Yeah.
they cracked,
Mhm.
right? But as many ex-social democrats, they went to right. And
Right.
So it's interesting. I'm just suggesting for you.
Yeah.
I don't know you have the answer. I'm just
Well, I mean-
suggesting if you go back to this in March,
Yeah.
look through these cracks, you see,
Mhm,
because
mhm.
the same discourse is using both sides.
Yes.
It's being used to destroy this kind of tradition that you were just saying it's important, right? And it's the only tradition that kept culture alive,
Right.
because there was no music or cultural, no art education.
No.
Right, at
Well,
all.
I mean, so people on the right though often too talk about all those programs as being a kind of like social assistance and welfare, right? Like this is just money that goes to people who don't really deserve it. So entrepreneurialism becomes a way to kind of soften that. If you're talking about, well, we're going to give public money to musicians, but they're going to be entrepreneurial, is playing into some of the right discourses of saying we're going to sort of create these autonomous workers, right, that don't rely on the state. Like we're just providing a platform, and that's good, right? Yeah, and you see that people who are more left-oriented still taking up those discourses because it's in their advantage, especially since even public funding when it was more robust in 2010, say, was still insufficient, right? So that's partly why you get this kind of the same discourses being spoken on both sides, because both kind of rely on the realities, which is there's still not enough money going around for people who don't have it, right? It also reminds me of a lot of the culture wars discourses of the 90s here in the United States, right? That there was a lot of discussion about censorship, especially in art like painting, that led to a lot of the privatization of pieces of the NEH, of other kinds of institutions, of PBS especially too, was severely defunded in the 1990s. That's why now you see ads on PBS. You never used to see ads for commercial products. And so that was really the right kind of retaking culture as its platform, and of family values not being expressed adequately in cultures. And you see that in the right now as well in Brazil, right? So often musicians become flashpoints for these kinds of discussions. Anything else? Great. Well, thank you all very much for your attention.